recording. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started off with the third step prayer, Rob, on page
Okay.
63.
You got it, my friend. Hello, everybody. Rob K., recovered alcoholic. God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. And I do thy always.
Thank you, Rob. And we have a guest, well, not guest, but it's going to be tonight. Today we're working on Dr. Bob's Nightmare. We're on the bottom of page 172, and we were having Bill S. Actually take us through this chapter. So, Bill, if you wanted to go ahead and take over, that'd be great. And welcome.
Yeah, hi, good morning. This is Bill S., alcoholic from New Jersey. Okay, like Leo pointed out, we're on the bottom of page 172. We did the first two pages, and basically what the first two pages of Dr. Bob's story did, it just gave us like an introduction into what Dr. Bob was about a little bit. It told us where he was born, his mother and father. They were exceptionally intelligent people. And then it talked a little bit about when he went to high school and he got out of high school and then he went to college. And the college that he went to was Dartmouth College, and that was a very good college. And back in the day, I don't know if it still is, it was one of the top colleges in the country. So Dr. Bob was actually a pretty smart guy, and he started drinking a lot when he was in college. Okay, so we're on the bottom of page 172. The 3 years I spent in Boston, Chicago, and Montreal in the employ of a large manufacturing concern selling railway supplies, gas engines of all sorts, and many other items of heavy hardware. During these years, I drank as much as my purse permitted, still without paying too greatly a penalty. Although I was beginning to have the morning jitters at times, I lost only a half day's work during these 3 years. So after college, he went to work. He was selling different kinds of hardware in different places. And for 3 years, he only missed a half a day of work, which is virtually nothing. I wouldn't even mention that if I missed a half a day of work in 3 years. That's absolutely nothing the way I understand that. And he was starting to wake up with the morning jitters. So you can see at this point, his alcoholism is starting to progress. He's waking up in the morning and he's got the after effects from the night before. And he's got the jitters, he's shaking a little bit. And that can happen to anybody, but when that starts happening on a regular basis, that's a red flag that you have a drinking issue. Okay, the first new paragraph on 173. My next move was to take up the study of medicine, entering one of the largest universities in the country. There I took up the business of drinking with much greater earnestness than I had previously shown. On account of my enormous capacity for beer, I was elected to membership in one of the drinking societies and soon became one of the leading spirits. Many mornings I have gone to class, and even though fully prepared, would turn and walk back to the fraternity house because of my jitters, not daring to enter the classroom for fear of making a scene should I be called on for recitation. So Bob decided to take up medicine, and he went to the University of Michigan. And this would have been in 1905. And he's starting to drink more and more. He's taking up drinking with a much greater earnestness. And now he's waking up, and he's got the morning jitters. Even though he's ready to go to class, sometimes he has to turn around and go back to the fraternity house because he's shaking too much, and he's afraid if he went to class, he's got to make a scene. So you can see his alcoholism is starting to progress. It's affecting what he's trying to do every day. He's not able to get to class, and he needs to go to class every single day, but he's still getting by. You know, this is the weird thing about alcoholism. Even though it's affecting us negatively, we still can get by, and we can still make a pretty good go of it. And that's what he's doing. Okay, the next paragraph. This went from bad to worse until sophomore spring, when after a prolonged period of drinking, I made up my mind that I could not complete my course. So I packed my grip and went south to spend a month on a large farm owned by a friend of mine. When I got the fog out of my brain, I decided that quitting school was very foolish and that I had better return and continue my work. When I reached school, I discovered that the faculty had other ideas on the subject. After much argument, they allowed me to return and take my exams, all of which I passed credibly. But they were much disgusted and told me they would attempt to struggle along without my presence. After many painful discussions, they finally gave me my credits, and I migrated to another of the leading universities of the country and entered as a junior that fall. So this is what we would consider the geographical cure. He decided to go away for a month to his friend's farm so he could dry out and get the fog out of his brain and whatever. And he decided he was going to quit school and everything. And then after he got the fog out of his brain, he realized that really isn't a good idea to quit school. So he tried to go back to school. And when he got back there, he found out that the faculty had other ideas. You know, they probably said to him, "Hey, look, pal, you left. Now stay out of here. We don't need you back here." And he argued with them a little bit, and they allowed him to take his final exams. And he passed them credibly. Now you can see how intelligent this guy is. He's actually a pretty smart guy. He missed a whole month of school while he was at this farm, and however many times he missed classes because he had the jitters in the morning, and he still was able to pass his exams credibly. Credibly means he respectably passed them, or he passed them decently. It means he did a pretty good job on his exams. So this is a guy that missed a lot of school, and he still managed to do good on his exams. There's people that go to school every single day and don't miss one day, and they have trouble passing their exams. So obviously, Dr. Bob was a very intelligent guy. He was pretty smart. He was able to work around things that were happening in his life, and he did that. And then they told him that they were going to struggle along without his presence. In other words, that's a nice way of saying, "Get the heck out of here. You know, hit the bricks, pal. We don't want you here anymore." You know? And they finally gave him his credits, and he migrated to another of the leading universities. And this university that he went to was called Rush University, and that's near Chicago. So he had to go to a different school to finish his medical studies because he basically got kicked out of there. It doesn't really say that, but that's pretty much what they said. "We don't want you here anymore." So he got kicked out. And Rush University, an interesting thing about it, it's named after Benjamin Rush. He was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and he was a doctor. And he advocated for the disease concept of alcoholism. And this is when the Declaration of Independence was signed. That was back in 1776. So this is not a new idea that some doctors thought that alcoholism was a disease. Like, not a lot of doctors went along with that idea, but this guy, Benjamin Rush, he was going along with the idea that alcoholics had a disease or a sickness, that we weren't just moral degenerates like most other people think, that we've got moral problems and we're troublemakers and that kind of stuff. He had the idea in his head that we have a disease. So it's interesting that he wound up in a college named after a guy that was advocating for the disease of alcoholism. All right, we're on the top of page 174. There my drinking became so much worse that the boys in the fraternity house where I lived felt forced to send for my father, who made a long journey in the vain endeavor to get me straightened around. This had little effect, however, for I kept on drinking and used a great deal more hard liquor than in former years. You can see the progression. His alcoholism is getting worse and worse. When this guy's drinking, he's getting drunker and drunker. Now, if you think about this, he was in a fraternity. The guys in a fraternity, they usually get drunk all the time. That's a normal occurrence for people in a fraternity. And he was getting so drunk that the fraternity guys had to call his father to come and see if they could get him straightened out. So I don't know how drunk he was getting, but he must have been getting really, really drunk. if you get so drunk that you're scaring the guys in the fraternity house, because people in a fraternity house, they think drinking is nothing. They think getting drunk is no big deal. So Dr. Bob must have really, really, really been a real heavy hitter at this time. And his father tried to straighten him up, and that didn't work. And he started using more hard liquor than before. So he's drinking more and more and more. You can see the progression of alcoholism. And most of us can identify with that. We may not identify with being in a fraternity house with our father, but we can identify with drinking more and more and more over time as we were becoming an alcoholic or after we turned into an alcoholic, because it's a progressive disease, and that's what happens to us. All right, the next paragraph on 174. Coming up to final exams, I went on a particularly strenuous spree. When I went to write the examination, my hand trembled so I could not hold a pencil. I passed in at least 3 absolutely blank books. I was, of course, soon on the carpet, and the upshot was that I had to go back for 2 more quarters and remain absolutely dry if I wished to graduate. This I did and proved myself satisfactory to the faculty, both in deportment and scholastically. So when he went to take his exams again, he was drinking so much before the day he had to take his exams. He had to shake so bad he couldn't hold a pencil. He couldn't even write. You can see there's a parallel between him and Bill Wilson. In Bill's story, Bill talks about when he was in law school and he went to take his exams, he was too drunk to think or to write. And Dr. Bob was shaking so much that he couldn't write them. So you can see the parallel between these two guys. Both of them had trouble taking their exams because of their alcoholism and their drinking. And then they told him, when it says he was soon on the carpet, that means he was soon in trouble. On the carpet means you're in trouble with whoever the authorities are, wherever you are. And then what it all came down to is they told him that he had to stay sober for the next 2 quarters. And he was able to do that. He was able to go through the next 2 quarters of school without drinking at all. So he wasn't a full-blown alcoholic at this time. He had the physical part, where once he took a drink, he couldn't stop, and he would get blasted, and then, he wouldn't be able to function correctly the next day. But when he really, really, really had to stop, when he was so scared that he was going to get thrown out of school, he was able to stay stopped for like 2 more quarters. So he didn't have that mental part kicking in yet that makes us drink against our will. He definitely had the physical part, but the mental part was maybe iffy at this point. Okay, the next paragraph. I conducted myself so credibly that I was able to secure a much coveted internship in a western city, where I spent 2 years. During these 2 years, I was kept so busy that I hardly left the hospital at all. Consequently, I could not get into any trouble. This is the City Hospital of Akron. So Dr. Bob got this internship in the Akron City Hospital, and he stayed there for 2 years, and he worked in the hospital so much, he didn't have time to go out and drink and get drunk. So that pretty much kept him out of trouble at that point. Again, he's an alcoholic at this point, but he doesn't have all of the symptoms of alcoholism. He has the physical part, but when he's got something important to do, he can stay sober because he was working all the time and he spent so much time in the hospital that kept him from drinking. After you get to become a full-blown alcoholic, it doesn't matter what you do, you're going to drink anyway. But he was at the point where he could stay sober, and he stayed sober for 2 years. Okay, when those 2 years were up, I opened an office downtown. I had some money and all the time in the world, and considerable stomach trouble. I soon discovered that a couple of drinks would alleviate my gastric distress, at least for a few hours at a time. So it was not at all difficult for me to return to my former excessive indulgence. So he opened up his own office, his own practice, his own doctor's office. And what happened was he was starting to have some stomach trouble. So he figured he would take a drink or two. You take a drink or two and it calms your stomach down. Alcohol makes us feel better, and his stomach feels, upset or whatever. So he takes a couple of drinks, and it makes his stomach feel better because he's got the physical part. The phenomenon of cravings kicks in, and in no time, he's back to where he was, his former excessive indulgence. That's how he words it. In other words, once he took a few drinks to calm his stomach down, he was not capable of stopping. So he's right back where he was when he was drinking all the time. By this time, I was beginning to pay very dearly physically, and in hope of relief, I voluntarily incarcerated myself at least a dozen times in one of the local sanitariums. So you can see how bad his drinking is getting at this time. He had to put himself in a local sanitarium at least a dozen times. For us, that would be like a rehab or whatever. A sanitarium is a place where people go to recuperate from some kind of sickness or illness, and he was in there a dozen times. So obviously, you can see how this stuff is it's catching up with him. No matter what he tries to do, once you start drinking when you're an alcoholic, it's going to get you somewhere down the line. We're on the top of page 175. I was between Skiller and Charybdis now, because if I did not drink, my stomach tortured me, and if I did, my nerves did the same thing. Skiller and Charybdis, that's like an educated way of saying you're between a rock and a hard place. That's in Greek mythology. Scylla was rocks or a reef that were in the Straits of Messina, and Charybdis was a whirlpool that was on the other side of the Straits of Messina. And the Straits of Messina is the water in between Italy and Sicily, and that was considered a major shipping lane. And a lot of times ships would get shipwrecked going through there. And in Greek mythology, they thought there was monsters in the Straits of Messina, and they called one Scylla and one Charybdis. And the rocks on the one side, if you looked at them from a distance, it looked like a sea monster coming up out of the sea. And on the other side, there was a whirlpool that supposedly could shipwreck a ship, well, whatever. So sometimes when you try to avoid one thing, you hit another. So Scylla and Charybdis, what that means is you're between a rock and a hard place. And why he was between a rock and a hard place is because if he did not drink, his stomach tortured him. And if he did drink, when he woke up the next day, he had the jitters and his nerves were torturing him. So no matter what he did, whether he drank or he didn't drink, he was going to be tortured by something. And the reason his stomach was torturing him was because before that, he drank so much. And one of the things that alcohol does when you overindulge in it, it inflames the lining of your stomach. So he would wake up, either with an inflamed stomach because he didn't drink, or if he did drink, he would wake up with the jitters. And the funny thing about this, when your stomach lining gets inflamed, if you take one or two drinks, somehow it takes that inflammation down. It calms down your stomach. So he's stuck here. If he drinks, he's going to be suffering for one thing. And if he doesn't drink, he's going to be suffering from the other thing. Okay. After 3 years of this, I wound up in the local hospital where they attempted to help me. But I would get my friends to smuggle in a quart or at least steal the alcohol about the building. So I got rapidly worse. So he wound up in the hospital to be treated for what's going wrong with him. And what was wrong with him is he was drinking too much. He winds up in a local hospital to be treated for this. And what does he do? He has his friends smuggle him in a quart. Don't let anybody tell you you can't drink in a hospital. I've heard a lot of people in AA, when they tell their stories, they tell how they got alcohol or they got drugs or whatever they were using while they were in a hospital being treated for something. So Dr. Bob was able to get this stuff in. And remember, he was a doctor, so he knew where everything was. And if his friends couldn't get a quart of liquor in there to him, he would steal the alcohol about the building. Hospitals have a lot of alcohol in there. They have rubbing alcohol, and that's the kind you can't drink, but they also have grain alcohol, ethyl alcohol, the type that we drink. Most hospitals have their own in-house pharmacy, and they use that ethyl alcohol as a solvent when they make these liquid medications. So He knew where everything was because he was a doctor and he worked in the hospitals before, and he knew where they kept everything. So he would sneak around, I guess, at night or whatever, and he would steal the alcohol that they had in the hospital that they used for whatever medical reasons they used it for. So this guy is not getting better. He's definitely getting worse. Even though they're trying to treat him for what's wrong with him, he's still, he's circumventing all the treatment because he's drinking while they're trying to treat him for, if you want to call it, they were treating him for alcoholism, and he's drinking while he's being treated for it. So it's not helping at all. All right, we're on the first new paragraph on page 175. Finally, my father had to send a doctor out from my hometown who managed to get me back there in some way. And I was in bed about 2 months before I could venture out of the house. You think about this. He was in bed for 2 months because of all of his drinking. This guy must have really, really beat himself up physically. He was to be in bed for 2 months. Most of us, we pass out for maybe a day and that's it. And then we crawl out of bed and we get back to what we're doing. And he was in bed for 2 months. So you can see how bad he got beat up from alcohol. I stayed about town a couple of months more and then returned to resume my practice. I think I must have been thoroughly scared by what had happened or by the doctor or probably both, so that I did not touch a drink again until the country went dry. The country went dry. That means when they started prohibition. So he was scared because of what happened to him, and he wound up in the hospital, and the doctor probably scared him and told him, if you drink again, it's going to wind up killing you, whatever. So he was able to stay dry for a period of time. And when the passing of the 18th Amendment, with the passing of the 18th Amendment, I felt quite safe. That was the amendment about prohibition that was passed on January 17th in 1920. And it wasn't abolished until 1933 on December 5th. So it was approximately a little longer than 13 years, almost, not quite 14, but almost 14 years they had this here 18th Amendment, and that was what we call prohibition. I knew everyone would buy a few bottles or cases of liquor as their exchequers permitted, and that it would soon be gone. Exchequers means your treasury or your bank account. What they did when they started prohibition, they voted on it in 1919, and it was going to take effect in January of 1920. So everybody had a warning that prohibition was coming. So people would run out and buy as much liquor as they could before they eliminated it. And what this here prohibition did, you weren't allowed to buy or sell or transport alcohol. That's pretty much what it said. It didn't say anything about you weren't allowed to drink it. You just weren't allowed to buy it or sell it or transport it. So if you already had some in your home, they weren't going to come kicking down the door and trying to take it away from you. You could finish up what you had. And for normal people, that would be 1 or 2 bottles of wine, that they had in their kitchen cabinet or whatever, that kind of stuff. But a lot of people, what they did when they heard prohibition was coming, they ran out and they bought as much as they could. A couple of cases to put down the basement or whatever, so it would last for a while, and that would soon be gone. Okay. Therefore, it would make no great difference, even if I should do some drinking. At the time, I was not aware of the almost unlimited supply the government made it possible for us doctors to obtain. Neither had I any knowledge of the bootlegger who soon appeared on the horizon. So Dr. Bob, at this point, he thought it didn't matter if he drank, because as soon as prohibition starts, all the alcohol is going to be gone. So I might as well just keep drinking now, because once it's gone, I won't be able to drink anymore. But he didn't realize that the government made it possible for doctors to get all the alcohol they needed, because doctors use alcohol in their practice. Sometimes they use it to treat patients. Sometimes they use it for certain medications, whatever. And he didn't know that the bootleggers were going to soon turn up. And bootleggers were all over the place during Prohibition. That was a big deal back then. In fact, that's how NASCAR got started. These bootleggers, they used to call them rum runners. They used to load up their trunk with stuff, and then they would race into a city or town or whatever so they could distribute it. and they used to soup up their cars so the cops couldn't catch them. And the cops didn't have souped up cars, and these rum runners did, and they were able to outrun the cops. And that eventually evolved into what we call NASCAR, because they started racing with each other to see who had the fastest car, and eventually that's how NASCAR started. So that was a big deal back then, you know, running alcohol or rum running, whatever you want to call it. I drank with moderation at first, but it took me only a relatively short time to drift back into the old habits, which had wound up so disastrously before. He's trying to control drinking. He's trying to drink in moderation. That doesn't work for us. Once you're an alcoholic, you're always an alcoholic. And once he started, he thought he was only going to have a couple, one or two, and, you know, just to calm down or whatever. Once we take it into our system, we activate the allergy, the phenomenon of craving kicks in, and then we're off to the races again. And that's pretty much what was happening to him at this point in his life. All right, the bottom of 175. During the next few years, I developed two distinct phobias. One was the fear of not sleeping, and the other was the fear of running out of liquor. Not being a man of means, I knew that if I did not stay sober enough to earn money, I would run out of liquor. Most of the time, therefore, I did not take the morning drink, which I craved so badly, but I instead filled up on large doses of sedatives to quiet the jitters, which distressed me terribly. So now he's at the point he realizes he has to go to work every day so that he can earn money to buy more alcohol. Even though when he wakes up in the morning, he wants to drink, but he knows he can't. So what he's doing is he's taking sedatives to quiet the jitters. He's treating his alcohol withdrawal symptoms with sedatives. And that's how they treat alcohol withdrawals. If you're going through the shakes or you're starting to show signs of the DTs, they will give you sedatives if you wind up in some kind of a medical facility. So he's treating his alcohol withdrawal symptoms. He's treating them with sedatives, but he's not treating the problem. The problem is he's drinking too much. And he's not treating the problem. He's treating the symptom. Occasionally, I would yield to the morning craving. But if I did, it would be only a few hours before I would be quite unfit for work. So he knew if he took a drink in the morning, he wouldn't be able to go to work. It would only be a few hours before he's unfit. He knew once he started, he couldn't stop. That's the phenomenon of cravings. That's what it does to us. So he knew once he took a drink, he wouldn't be able to stop. And sometimes he would have to take a drink because even though the sedatives weren't going to help him enough, he just said, oh, the heck with it, let me have a drink anyway. You know? This would lessen my chances of smuggling some home that evening, which in turn would mean a night of futile tossing around in bed, followed by a morning of unbearable jitters. During the subsequent 15 years, I had sense enough never to go to the hospital if I had been drinking. Very seldom did I receive patients. I would sometimes hide out in one of the clubs of which I was a member and had the habit at times of registering in a hotel under a fictitious name. But my friends usually found me, and I would go home if they promised that I should not be scolded. So you can see he's trying to work around this drinking, and it's not really working. He's winding up getting drunk, or he's got to take sedatives in the morning to calm him down so he can go to work. And there's times when he would hide out in one of the clubs that he belonged to, or he would go to a hotel and he would register under a fictitious name. In other words, he would use a fake name. I don't know what name he used. His name was Bob Smith. I mean, really, what did he use? John Smith? I mean, really, that to me, that's kind of silly, but that's what he did. He's trying to beat this game, and he's not able to do it because the alcoholism is in his brain, and no matter what he does, he's still going to wind up drinking again. If my wife was planning to go out in the afternoon, I would get a large supply of liquor and smuggle it home and hide it in the coal bin, the clothes chutes, over the door jambs, over beams in the cellar, and in cracks in the cellar tile. I also made use of old trunks and chests, the old can container, and even the ash container. The water tank on the toilet I never used, because it looked too easy. And I found out later that my wife inspected it frequently. I used to put 8 or 12-ounce bottles of alcohol in a fur-lined glove and toss it onto the back airing porch when winter days got dark enough. My bootlegger had hidden alcohol at the back steps where I could get it at my convenience. So you can see what he's going through here. He's hiding liquor all over the place, everywhere he can think of, all over his house, or over the door jams, in the coal bin, in the clothes chutes, or everywhere. The beams in the cellar. I mean, can anybody identify with that? Hiding your booze, hiding your bottles. That's what he's doing. He's hiding stuff so his wife can't find it, so that he'll still have it to drink. Sometimes I would bring it in my pockets, but they were inspected, and that became too risky. I used to put it up in 4-ounce bottles and stick several in my stocking tops. This worked nicely until my wife went to see Wallace Berry in Tugboat Annie, after which the pant leg and stocking racket were out. That was a famous a play or whatever, Tugboat Annie, back in the day, and I guess there was an alcoholic in there that was hiding his bottles in his stocking tops or whatever, and when his wife saw that in the play, she figured that out, and he couldn't use that anymore. These are all the different places that Dr. Bob was trying to hide his liquor. So you can see how his disease is progressing. This isn't a guy that's just drinking on the weekends. This is a guy that has to have his drink all the time, every day, and he's hiding it all over the place so that nobody gets all of it. His wife can't get it all and get it away from him. All right, we're on the top of page 177. I will not take space to relate all my hospital or sanitarium experiences. So I don't know how many times he was in a hospital or a sanitarium, but evidently it was a lot. And he's not going to even talk about it here because it would take up too much space. During this time, I became more or less ostracized by our friends. That means his friends were starting to avoid him. They were shunning him or they were avoiding him. We could not be invited out because I would surely get tight, and my wife dared not invite people in for the same reason. So his friends and acquaintances and everything, all these people are avoiding him because he's going to get drunk all the time. My phobia for sleeplessness demanded that I get drunk every night. But in order to get more liquor for the next night, I had to stay sober during the day, at least up to 4 o'clock. This routine went on with few interruptions for 17 years. It was really a horrible nightmare. It's earning money, getting liquor, smuggling it home, getting drunk, morning jitters, taking large doses of sedatives to make it possible for me to earn more money, and so on ad nauseum. Ad nauseum means to a sickening degree. But for 17 years, this is what Dr. Bob did. He would wake up in the morning with the jitters, take sedatives to calm down his jitters so he could go to work. He would go to work to earn money, get money so he could buy his liquor, smuggle it back home, hide it wherever he could hide it, then drink it all night long and get drunk again, and then wake up the next day and just start the whole process over and over and over again. He was stuck in this loop of alcoholism. I used to promise my wife, my friends, and my children that I would drink no more. Promises which seldom kept me sober, even through the day, though I was very sincere when I made them. Most of us can probably identify with that. How many times we promised we're never going to drink again, and we meant it when we said that, and what happens? An hour later or 2 hours later, we're drinking again. So that kind of stuff doesn't work. Making promises just for whatever reason does not work for us. For the benefit of those experimentally inclined, I should mention the so-called beer experiment. When beer first came back, I thought it was safe. I could drink all I wanted of that. It was harmless. Nobody ever got drunk on beer. So I filled the cellar full with the permission of my good wife, and it was not long before I was drinking at least a case and a half a day. A case and a half of beer, that's a lot of beer. A case is 24. So he was drinking 36 bottles of beer every day. I mean, I guess they just had bottles back then. I don't know if they had cans of beer yet, but a can of beer or a bottle of beer is the same amount of beer. So he was drinking 36 beers a day. That's quite a lot. That's a lot of liquid to drink if you think about that. 36 cans of spring water or 36 bottles of spring water. That's a lot. That's a lot of volume to drink. So this guy was really putting it away. I put on 30 pounds of weight in 2 months, looked like a pig, and was uncomfortable from the shortness of breath. It then occurred to me that after one was all smelled up with beer, nobody could tell what had been drunk. So I began to fortify my beer with straight alcohol. Of course, the result was very bad, and that ended the beer experiment. So he thought he was going to get away with drinking beer because nobody gets drunk on beer. And he drank so much of it, he was getting drunk on it. Then he got this brainstorm that once you drink beer, you smell like you drank beer. Nobody knows what you drank. So I'll add some straight alcohol to the beer so I can get there a little bit faster, So that's just what he did, Candy is dandy, but liquor is quicker. So, and he figured that out right away. If he adds straight alcohol to his beer, it's going to be quicker and he's going to get drunk faster. We're on the top of 178. About the time of the beer experiment, I was thrown in with a crowd of people who attracted me because of their seeming poise, health, and happiness. This crowd of people that he's talking about, this would be the Oxford Groupers. This was Bob's first contact with the Oxford Group, and this was in the beginning of 1933, probably somewhere around January of 1933 when he first went to the Oxford Group. His wife, Anne, kind of dragged him there and got him there because I think she was going there before he went because she had some friends that were going to this Oxford Group, and she brought Bob there with her because she figured it could help him. They spoke with great freedom from embarrassment, which I could never do, and they seemed very much at ease on all occasions and appeared very healthy. More than these attributes, they seemed to be happy. I was self-conscious and ill at ease most of the time. My health was at a breaking point, and I was thoroughly miserable. This guy was miserable all the time. We would call that restless, irritable, and discontented, like it talked about in Dr. Silkworth's, the doctor's opinion. And that's what Dr. Silkworth talked about. When we don't have a drink, we're restless, irritable, and discontented. And when Bob's not drinking, he's at this breaking point. He's thoroughly miserable. That's pretty much the same thing as restless, irritable, and discontented. I sensed that they had something I did not have, from which I might readily profit. I learned that it was something of a spiritual nature, which did not appeal to me very much, but I thought it could do no harm, and gave the matter much time and study for the next 2.5 years, but still got tight every night nevertheless. So for 2.5 years, Bob was trying this Oxford Group method or whatever you want to call it, and he thought it would help him get better, but he got tight every night. That means he got drunk every night, even though he went to the Oxford Group all the time, and he tried practicing what they said for 2.5 years. And the reason is he did not identify with anybody that was in the Oxford Group. The Oxford Group was not about sobriety. It was not about not drinking. The Oxford Group was about salvation. It was about going to heaven. And Bob didn't identify with these people. These people were talking about not sinning. And Bob didn't want to know how to not sin. Bob wanted to know how to not drink. And they weren't talking about that because basically there wasn't any other alcoholics in the Oxford Group where Dr. Bob was, so he couldn't identify with these people. I read everything I could find and talked to everyone who I thought knew anything about it. So he was trying to find out all that he could about alcoholism and what he could do about it. And he couldn't really find anybody that could talk to him and tell him what he needed to do. He was reading stuff and he was going to the Oxford Group, and the Oxford Group was just telling him to pray and ask God to save you. That That's a wonderful, marvelous thing to do, prayer and asking God for help. But you have to do your part too. And he didn't know what his part was. And, it's just like you can have all the faith in the world. You can have the faith that there's electricity in your home that's going to light up your lights, but they won't go on until you do your part. You have to get up and flip on the light switch. And Dr. Bob didn't know what his part was. So he was asking God to help him, and he was going to these Oxford group gatherings, but they weren't working for him because he wasn't identifying with the people there, because there wasn't really any other alcoholics at least in the area where he was in the Oxford group. All right, the last paragraph on 178. My wife became deeply interested, and it was her interest that sustained mine, though at no time sensed that it might be an answer to my liquor problem. How my wife kept her faith and courage during all these years, I'll never know, but she did. If she had not, I know I would have been dead a long time ago. For some reason, we alcoholics have the gift of picking out the world's finest women. Why they should be subjected to the tortures we inflict upon them, I cannot explain. About this time, a lady called up my wife one Saturday afternoon, saying she wanted me to come over that evening to meet a friend of hers who might help. It was the day before Mother's Day, and I had come home plastered, carrying a big potted plant, which I set down on the table, and forthwith went upstairs and passed out. Forthwith means at once. So he came home the day before Mother's Day, he brought home a plant for his wife for Mother's Day, and he just wound up going right upstairs and passing out. The next day she called again, wishing to be polite, though I felt very badly, and I said, let's make the call, and extracted from my wife a promise we would not stay over 15 minutes. So basically, this is when Bill Wilson got in touch with Henrietta Seiberling when he made that phone call from the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel, and Henrietta called up Dr. Bob to try to get Dr. Bob to come over and talk to Bill Wilson, and she didn't get Dr. Bob on the phone. She got Dr. Bob's wife because Dr. Bob was passed out. This says he was passed out up in his bedroom. He went upstairs and passed out. Some people tell the story he passed out right in the kitchen. I don't know where he was passed out, but he was passed out. And they decided that, up there, you'll have to come tomorrow, call back tomorrow, and we'll see what we can do. And she called back the next day and invited them over for dinner. And Bob said, okay, we'll go, but we're only going to stay 15 minutes. All right? We entered our house at exactly 5 o'clock. And it was 11:15 when we left. They were there for 6 hours and 15 minutes. So I don't know how long Bob talked to Bill, whatever, when they got there, their introductions and hellos, however long that took. And if they tried to eat dinner, I think Bob couldn't eat dinner because his stomach was so upset. So I have no idea how long it took before they got into the room to talk. But Bob was there for 6 hours and 15 minutes. According to this, and he was only going to stay 15 minutes. Thank God he stayed long enough to listen to what Bill had to tell him. I had a couple of shorter talks with this man afterwards and stopped drinking abruptly. This dry spell lasted about 3 weeks. Then I went to Atlantic City to attend several days meeting of a national society of which I was a member. I drank all the scotch they had on the train and brought several quarts on my way to the hotel. So here's a guy trying to get sober. He goes to this American Medical Association convention that they have in Atlantic City. Atlantic City is in New Jersey. That's a big famous place. It was a famous resort years ago. Today they turned it into a bunch of casinos and that kind of stuff. But and when he was on his way there, he drank all the scotch they had on the train. So you can see this guy's a real heavy hitter. And when he got there, he went to the store and he bought several more quarts to bring with him back to his hotel. This was on Sunday. I got tight that night, stayed sober Monday till after dinner, then proceeded to get tight again. I drank all I dared in the bar, then went to my room to finish the job. So he was drinking in the bar after the convention or whatever with the other people that were there, and he decided that he better go up to his room and finish it. because he didn't want to embarrass himself in front of his colleagues or the other people that were there. Tuesday, I started in the morning, getting well organized by noon. I take that means by noon he was drunk. I did not want to disgrace myself, so I then checked out. I bought some more liquor on the way to the depot. I had to wait some time for the train. I remember nothing from then on until I woke up at a friend's house in a town near home. So basically, he got drunk at this convention, and he figured he better get out of there before he embarrasses himself or makes a fool of himself. So he went home, and on the way home, he bought more liquor to bring home with him. And he got so drunk he was in a blackout the whole train ride on the way home. And all he remembers is he woke up at a friend's house. That was his office nurse's house. Somehow, when he got to the train depot in Akron, either him or somebody on the train, or I don't know, the conductor or one of the porters there, or maybe him, somebody called up his office nurse, and she came down with her husband and picked him up and brought him home to her home. And then they called up his wife, and she sent Bill Wilson over to pick him up and bring him home. So these good people notified my wife, who sent my newly made friend over to get me. He came and got me home into bed. He gave me a few drinks that night and one bottle of beer the next morning. That was June 10th, 1935, and that was my last drink. As I write this, nearly 4 years have passed. The question which might naturally come to mind would be, what did this man do or say that was different from what others had done or said? I must be remembered that I had read a great deal and talked to everyone who knew or thought they knew anything about the subject of alcoholism. But this was a man who had experienced many years of frightful drinking, who had had the most of the drunkard's experiences known to man, but who had been cured by the very means I had been trying to employ. That is to say, the spiritual approach. He gave me information about the subject of alcoholism, which was undoubtedly helpful. In other words, Bill told him the nature of alcoholism that Bill learned from Dr. Silkworth. So here's a stockbroker explaining a disease to a doctor. This is backwards. It should have been the other way around. Dr. Bob didn't understand what alcoholism was or what it was doing to him, but since Bill went through the town's hospital and Dr. Silkworth explained it to Bill, Bill was able to explain it to Dr. Bob. Of far more importance was the fact that he was the first living human with whom I had ever talked who knew what he was talking about in regards to alcoholism from actual experience. In other words, he talked my language. In other words, Bill talked alcoholic to an alcoholic. You know, most people, and this probably happened to a lot of us, people tell us, use your willpower. Why don't you just choose not to drink? Why don't you count your drinks, and when you get to 3, just stop? Yeah, that stuff works for social drinkers. That doesn't work for an alcoholic. And Bill was telling Dr. Bob what worked for Bill after Bill went through the process that he went through in the town's hospital and in the Oxford group when Ebby came over and Ebby explained to him what he needed to do. And so Bill was explaining this to Dr. Bob. He was telling Dr. Bob about how Bill drank and how Bill got better. He wasn't telling Dr. Bob, why don't you quit drinking? Why don't you pull yourself up by your bootstraps? And that's usually what everybody else says to us. And Bill didn't talk about Bob. Bill talked about Bill's drinking, and Bob identified with him. That's the key to this whole program, is identifying with each other. And when Dr. Bob was in the Oxford group, he didn't identify with anybody in the Oxford group because all those people were trying to stop sinning. They weren't trying to stop drinking. There was basically no drinkers, at least in the area where Bob was. He knew all the answers, and certainly not because he had picked them up in his reading. It is a most wonderful blessing to be relieved of the terrible curse which I was afflicted. My health is good, and I have regained my self-respect and the respect of my colleagues. My home life is ideal, and my business is as good as can be expected in these uncertain times. I spend a great deal of time passing on what I had learned to others. That's important. That's what keeps us sober, and that's what Dr. Bob did. He spent a lot of time trying to pass this on to other alcoholics and that's what kept him from drinking, who wanted and needed badly. I do it for 4 reasons. 1, a sense of duty. 2, it is a pleasure. 3, because in doing so, I am paying my debt to the man who took time to pass it on to me. And 4, because every time I do it, I take out a little more insurance for myself against a possible slip. Every time somebody tries to pass this message on to another alcoholic, we're going through it again. Who's ever passing the message on is going through the process again, and it makes your program stronger. That's why we do this, because it gives us a little bit of insurance against a slip or a relapse. Unlike most of our crowd, I did not get over my cravings for liquor during the first 2.5 years of abstinence. So Dr. Bob still was waking up with urges to drink for 2.5 years. It was almost always with me, but at no time have I been anywhere near yielding. In other words, he was doing what we call white knuckling it. He could stay sober even though he's still thinking about drinking. He still was wanting to drink. He's still looking at other people that were going out to drink that night and saying, boy, why can't I go out with them? And it was still in his mind. He still had it, but he wasn't ready to yield yet because of the spiritual program that he was following. He had the strength to stay sober. I used to get terribly upset when I saw my friends drink and knew I could not. But I schooled myself to believe that though I had once had the same privilege, I had abused it so frightfully that it was withdrawn. So it doesn't behoove me to squawk about it, for after all, nobody had to throw me down and pour liquor down my throat. He's accepting the fact that he's an alcoholic and he can't drink anymore, because if he does, he's going to wind up drunk. So he's got the right mindset, and he probably got all of this from Bill when Bill explained to Dr. Bob what Bill did and how Bill was staying sober. If you think you are an atheist or an agnostic, a skeptic, or have any other form of intellectual pride which keeps you from accepting what is in this book, I feel sorry for you. If you still think you are strong enough to beat the game alone, that is your affair. But if you really and truly want to quit drinking liquor for good and all, and sincerely feel that you must have some help, we know that we have the answer for you. It never fails if you go about it with half the zeal you have been in the habit of showing when you were getting another drink. In other words, if you put half the effort into getting sober that you put in to get drunk, you're going to make it. That's pretty much what he's saying here. And then this last line, he says, your heavenly Father will never let you down. In other words, if you rely on your heavenly Father and do what this program says, and you do your part, you've got a really, really good chance of getting sober and staying sober. This is the best solution that anybody's come up with. Okay, well, we finished this. Does everybody understand it? Any questions? Whatever. Turn it back over to Leo.
Bill, thank you very, very much. That was awesome. I love it every time you go through that with us on Dr. Bob's Nightmare. So thank you once again, and really do appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's an honor to do it.
Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank
Kate,
you
Leo,
once
and
again, Bill.
Rob as well. Thank you.
Thank you all. Much
Thank you so
appreciated.
much.
Great reading, Bill.
We'll go ahead and close out with the Serenity Prayer, Rob, and then we'll.
You got it, my friend. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference.